So this is the task for the homework. This is a new project. It's based on JavaSMT for the PC configuration. So you already saw some examples of how to use JavaSMT in the other video. And now this is a very similar project, but here the task is slightly different. So now you're not going to manually encode the formulas in the Java SMT API to solve the SMT problem. What you're going to use is those formulas are going to be created. So you're going to write code that creates formulas that you don't know in advance. And the reason that you don't know it in advance is that for this PC configuration example, so we're using the same kind of example with minimal changes. Now, instead of having the components up front and being able to create those variables for the components by their names and listing them manually, we're going to read them from CSV files. So they could change. We could give completely different components and completely different constraints. So we're going to read components and their categories and their prices from a CSV file. So that's this one here. See, we have CPU, then the name of the CPU, and then the price, and so on. So that's now something that is no longer fixed. It will be read from a file, and this file could obviously change. Similarly, constraints will also be read from a file. So there are some constraints here, and the constraints can be of two kinds. They can either be requires or excludes. They have the same meaning as we had for feature models. So requires means if you have an i3, then you need to have the Intel mainboard, and this excludes, you can see it in both ways. So the RTX excludes the GTX and the GTX excludes the RTX. Similarly for the mainboards, they exclude each other. But now you're not going to encode this excludes constraints as a constraint with those two parameters as values manually. You're going to write code that reads these files and creates the constraints automatically. You have those like generic constraints here, which are not written in the file because they are valid no matter what. So every valid PC needs at least components from these categories: CPU, motherboard, RAM, storage. And then in the program, when it runs, the user will provide a budget on the console. You will read the files, translate the files into an SMT problem, solve it using JavaSMT, and then interpret the model in the way that you will print the list of components in the configuration. So you're not just going to dump the model to the console, but you're going to give a readable output of the model on the console by listing what components are going to be included in the build of the PC. So again, you can either download this as a zip or clone it from this URL, this project. So I did clone it already. Now I'm just going to import it. And yeah, it's in that folder. So yeah, it looks like everything compiles. So now there are already some files where you're going to do the implementation, and there are also some files that do the reading for you. So here there's this PC config reader. It has a get components method, and you give the category of the component. So the categories, this can be CPU, mainboard, things like that. And then you also have a second method that reads the constraints for you, where you give whether it's a requires constraint or an excludes constraint, and it's going to give you a list of pairs of strings. So these pairs are basically the ones that are written in the files here. So in the constraints, you're going to ask it for maybe the requires constraints, and then it will give you the first 3 here, because the other 2 are excludes, so it's not going to give you the excludes ones when you're asking for the requires ones. And then it will be pairs where first element in the pair is i3, second element is this gigabyte Intel mainboard. Then the next list element will have again a pair, i7 and gigabyte Intel. So that's the kind of output you can expect. And it's already, these methods are already being called just to demonstrate how it works. So here we have a method print components of kind CPU. And you see here we're asking this PC config reader get components of this type. What's going to happen is that you can like safely remove this stuff or leave it there. I'm not sure, whatever you prefer. You could remove these. The important method call that you need to have somewhere is where you read the PC configuration for the kind. You need to include all kinds. So here, yeah, just make sure you you take all of those into consideration. You don't have to consider additional types. So if there are additional types, then they will not be relevant for you. So just take this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 types. That should be enough. Those are the ones you can expect. And here in the CSV files, of course, we only have examples for these types. And then the constraints, there's requires and excludes. And again, we're having a very similar piece of code where we just read these constraints and then print them, where we take the first element of the pair and the second element of the pair and say what kind of constraint they are. So if we just run this main method, you will see we are going to be asked to enter a budget. You can keep that code because the user will always enter a budget, which is the price of the PC, the maximum that they're going to spend. Then you're going to read those files, create some SMT formula, solve it using JavaSMT, and then you're going to interpret the model afterwards. So let's just going to run it. Let's just run it. We're going to enter a budget, maybe 300. And then we see it just prints all of this stuff. So it prints the available components, first of the CPUs, then the motherboards. They're just all here. And then it reads those constraints, first the requires ones. So those 3 here are the requires constraints, and then the excludes constraints. The reason that you can distinguish between them is because they need different translations. But yeah, there's not much other stuff here. So the task is to basically translate all this to formulas where you take into consideration the budget, the prices, and the constraints, and this also the base constraint here. The base constraint was that one of each is included out of these. So that is not encoded in the CSV files. This is like a base constraint that you need to add in addition. Yes, and then you need to interpret the model afterwards. And you need to expect that somebody might put different files here, and then your code should still work and still find possible configuration, or say that it can't find one, maybe because the budget is too low.